the lack of acceptance of exactly where we're at is the seed of that struggling with existence, that separation, that rejecting what's here and now. And so the deepest surrender you can do is to fall in love with everything exactly as it is in that moment. There's true mortification of the ego in the service of love. If you can grieve everything and just be like, and put out your own egoic fire to that extent, where you're willing to feel all the pain about it and let it be as it is and show up to reduce suffering. If you get rid of that personal bit and you let all the emotions move through, then you can show up and be like, reality is perfect in its manifestation as it is. And through my human mind, I can see all the suffering that I want to help improve. And both those things can coexist and support each other. But it requires you to have the courage to really face yourself in your deepest parts that you don't want to go into. But if you do go there, there's a harmony there that you wouldn't expect, I guess.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Psychedelic Conversations. We have a returning guest, James Cooke, in the house. Welcome, James.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to be back.
So good to see you again, and also to create this time for us to come back and share, because it's always great to follow up on our guests and where they are headed and their progress. It's always a treat to come back and follow up.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the last conversation, so happy to be back.
Fantastic. So I just want to say a few lines from your bio, just so our listeners can be familiar with you in case they are seeing you and meeting you for the first time. So you are a neuroscientist, writer, and a speaker. Your work focuses on consciousness with an interest in meditative and psychedelic states, which I'm going to also kind of touch on the psychedelics and where you are on that path. And you study experimental psychology and neuroscience at Oxford University, and passionate about exploring science and spirituality.
Yeah, that sums me up.
And yes, I mean, there's a lot more, but we'll add it into the show notes and your links for our listeners who are curious to know more and read more about you. So, and one of the reasons that I'm excited to be speaking to you today is because you have just been working and launching your book, The Dawn of Mind. So this is really exciting. Congratulations. And
Thank you.
I'd like to really dive into it and hear the message. What are you sharing? What have you been working on since the last time? But before that, can we dive into your observations and overview of where do you think we're headed in the psychedelic space currently, and where you are in it, and everything to do with psychedelics?
Yeah, so I started speaking in public out of, initially I wasn't speaking about psychedelics. I was initially speaking about kind of science and spirituality. So, who I am, in terms of why I'm speaking public is someone who had a kind of very profound spiritual awakening as a teenager, in the context of, like a lot of kids of that age, rejecting kind of dogmatism of the religion I'd grown up in. And the thing that really struck me about it was that it wasn't supernatural, that it was the most naturalistic, just dropping in, like being fully present for the first time in my life in a really profound way. And I think from that point on, I was motivated to talk about this, basically about how these profound states of consciousness are a possibility for people, profound states of well-being associated with them, sense of being fully at home in the universe, all that good stuff. And you don't have to believe anything, ridiculous or anything delusional, because I think I would have had the impression that these were like delusional states if I hadn't experienced it for myself. So then I started speaking about that in public, and then became very interested in the psychedelic developments in neuroscience, partly because, for someone who's interested in science and spirituality, psychedelics are a great intersection, right? Because you've got this material substance that's interacting with the material brain in a controlled scientific setting, yet it produces reliably these kinds of states I'm talking about, So that was my motivation for initially talking about psychedelics in a kind of hope that they might be able to democratize these kinds of states instead of having to kind of stumble into them or meditate your entire life to get to them. And then so I experimented with them myself to kind of check they did what I thought they did, and then that really. Then I went on my own kind of personal journey. Basically, that really opened me up emotionally, and there was lots of stuff in me that I didn't realize was there that I really had to process, and that was a really beautiful journey that really kind of, that's when I really got into them in terms of a catalyst for my own kind of spiritual development, in terms of going from an understanding of spirituality that was very much based around consciousness and kind of, but not very embodied, into something that was a lot more embodied and, to do with emotional depth and that kind of stuff. So, as of a couple of years ago, that phase ended in my own personal practice. And that's around the time I started writing the book. And so for the last few years, I've been really back where I started in terms of science and spirituality. And kind of like leaving the psychedelic field to do its own thing for now. So I've not been following the developments as much over the last couple of years as I was when we spoke last. So my hope has always been that they can be, I guess, you have conventional approaches to well-being, like therapy and changes in mindset, that kind of thing, but they have a certain kind of flaw that is typically unacknowledged, which you could call the ego or the self, or just there's something there that creates a kind of block that prevents really deep transformative change often for people. And then with psychedelics, with meditation, with spiritual kind of approaches, I think it makes sense to have different terminology, talking about psychospiritual stuff instead of just calling it like an extension of psychology, because you really do get into this level of, oh, actually, I'm not what I thought I was, and my relationship to the rest of the universe isn't what I thought it was. I thought I was small and separate. Turns out I'm a manifestation of the unfolding of existence, all that kind of good stuff. My hope has always been that the field will open that up for more and more people. And that's, I guess, there are individual things that play out that sometimes make me concerned that, I guess, you have the initial kind of excitement and optimism that this is really going to change things, and then you start to see how the usual systems kind of try to appropriate it and box it in and actually limit the transformative change. I don't want to get into like bad mouthing particular kind of places that's happened, but I think that's also sobered me a bit when it comes to my evangelism around psychedelics, and that I think I don't currently feel like we're going to have a second 60s or something truly transformative. It feels like that kind of the systems are successfully boxing them in and limiting their transformative potential, I think. So that might also be why I'm less, my head is less in that space at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so valuable. And I'm so glad that you're speaking very directly to the psychedelic field at the moment. As you know, so many things are happening, negative and also positive. But, it's so interesting you said that psychedelics, kind of came about again as if it's a panacea and it's going to really drive this transformative processes. And also somehow it was the cure or the magic, the thing that we've been waiting for the mental health, right? But it's not really doing that currently. If anything, we're hearing more and more negative experiences, re-traumatizations, people falling into more depression and kind of losing hope even more further. Not diminishing the positivity and the beautiful effects of the medicine, but I want to tie it down with maybe we still don't understand them. Maybe we have no idea what they are here for. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll ever reach a point where I don't think they're wonderful things that should be available for people. I think they're truly wonderful substances. And I think that I also still am in touch with the evangelism because I think that the reason that there was the hope that they could be a panacea is the way that I think about it, I guess, is that discord at all levels arises from a sense of separation. So, if you look in kind of Buddhism, it's the sense of feeling like you're a separate self who has to struggle and manage existence. That creates a kind of sense of discord and suffering. And then you go up to the level of kind of interhuman oppression, and there's an othering dynamics there, where you treat people less than human because you're othering them as you're somehow different and separate from them. And then you look at what we're doing to the planet, and again, there's a distancing of us from nature. So I think there's this like fractal structure of separation that is I say fractal because it goes all the way down from the individual up to the largest way, scales at which we organize. And I think on the individual level, well, so the solution, if you want to call it that, to that is to orient away from separation and to wholeness and the harmony that comes from wholeness and connection. And psychedelics, in the right circumstances, can do that. They can quite reliably promote connection and kind of homeostatic rebalancing, coming into right relationship with the world. But if they're not held well, they can also lead to kind of rebounds in the opposite direction. And because we're in this like Russian doll structure of like the nestedness of the separation, this is what I was saying about like the psychedelics aren't going to work to change systems that have perverse incentives that are designed to kind of not to help people with well-being, but are designed to make money for people. So I think that's why it's like what they're pointing towards is something that's a lot bigger. It's simultaneously a lot bigger and more complex than psychedelic healing because it involves politics all the way down to individual psychology and how we can kind of build community to hold each other. But it's also a lot simpler in that it is just that orienting to wholeness, I think, in terms of, which again is why this stuff for me comes down to kind of spirituality, which is, I guess you could say the core of it is that, or in every moment you have that choice to live a life of distracting yourself from the present moment and feeling like a self who's chasing whatever goals they think they're pursuing in the hall of mirrors of thought in their own mind, which is the usual kind of mind-identified state, or you can be deeply present and feel fundamentally part of existence. But, that can be a challenging path, which is why people often need kind of psychedelics and things to help with that and again, support and guidance. So I'm not just saying everyone should just do that because it's that easy, but that for me, that is the choice is that simplicity of orienting to wholeness and authenticity and sincerity in the present moment is what it comes down to. I think that healing I'm talking about, I don't think it actually could happen. Well, I'd be surprised if it could happen thoroughly without psychedelics. I think when there's trauma in the system, you need substance. Often a lot of people, I think, need substances just at a basic physiological level to reintroduce that plasticity and allow the healing to happen. But yeah, they're not going to be a panacea. That's the only thing that moves us in that direction.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you for sharing that. It's almost like, I had a really interesting message on LinkedIn today that was really fascinating, and it synchronistically kind of feeds into the conversation today. And the person that sent me this message said that, for example, call the mushrooms a political agent, and they are, seen as a sentient, beings with their own personalities and their own sort of territory. And there was this resentment towards this 55 years of oppression and pressure of the science to kind of commodify and really make sense of these things. But you don't. You show up to open yourself up to these energies and sentient experiences, and again ties into the spiritual perspective that you talk about. And this is so interesting. And you also, in the summary of your book, you say that the science and the spirituality should be synthesized.
Right.
How do you see all this coming together? And it would be lovely to hear sort of a summary of your book and what is the message that you're trying to share?
Yeah, so I guess there are two messages. There's a kind of that synthesis of science and spirituality that I think is necessary if we're going to understand ourselves and our place in existence. And then there's a more practical scientific kind of putting together the pieces of the puzzle so that it's not just me hand waving, but it's like quite rigorously saying, this is what I think is what gives rise to experience. Like this is where experience fits into our picture of the universe, because at the moment, that's the big divide is in terms of our scientific understanding, in terms of how does mind relate to matter. So that's the thing I'm really trying to tackle. So I think the reason that contemplative insight or spirituality, or whatever terms you want to use, awakening, I think the reason that stuff is necessary in order to, as a kind of corrective for our current way that consciousness scientists, philosophers, people in general are approaching consciousness in the mainstream, is that I mentioned it before, the kind of the usual state of mind identification is that you think that you are genuinely a self that is smaller, that's kind of it's alienated from a bigger world, and it's trying to navigate in this world, and it's fundamentally, like this small separate thing. It inhabits the body somewhere, maybe somewhere behind the eyes, and it looks out at the world. And the world is this kind of mind independent thing. It's like fully separate from me, and it's kind of relatively stable. And like all of that whole paradigm, when I'm talking about awakening or kind of spiritual insight, contemplative insight, I'm basically talking about discovering that whole paradigm of feeling like a self inhabiting a world arises within awareness, arises within as kind of, it's like a framework of mental ideas that, so take like the future, right? Like you never actually experience the future directly. Whenever tomorrow comes, it's today. So really we're on a treadmill of the present moment. And yet we really extrapolate from that past and future have some kind of reality and solidity, but actually that's all a kind of manifestation of the mind. And really what's happening is there's kind of visual appearances arising, there's sound arising, there's internal sound and visual appearances in thought space. And that's the kind of the palliative experience. And that all gets woven together to this really complex kind of feeling of navigating the world. So when you have a kind of a rupture in that, the kind of, it's like our usual way of experiencing is like a stable fantasy. It's like we're in this fantasy of the way we live our lives. And then you can just wake up from that in an instant if you just stop being emotionally invested in it. And what happens is it's radically different. You discover that, there is just the one unfolding of existence, that you are fully part of it, that there are no bounds or separations between anything. And this is just all really obvious. It's just kind of really clear, staring you in the face. So, to the average person who hasn't engaged any of this terrain, and this, you can have these experiences in psychedelics as well. Obviously, everything starts to dissolve. It's actually a good way to, when I first say that our usual way of experiencing the world is an appearance in awareness or a fantasy, that could sound weird to people because it really feels like you're looking at, an objective world. But people had an impression of this when they saw that dress that went viral on social media, where it looked different to different people. And suddenly they realize, oh, actually, that dress isn't objectively a certain color. We're all carrying around our own simulations of the world, what Immanuel Kant called the phenomenal world, the world we experience. And I do think behind it there's some unknowable world in itself. But anyway, that's the point. We're all carrying this simulation that we inhabit and think is the real world. And then if you take a psychedelic, suddenly everything starts to meld, at sufficient doses, and then suddenly it all dissolves and it becomes really clear. Oh, wait a minute. This was always appearances arising in this bright, shining awareness. Like, what the heck is going on there? And then that can lead some people to idealism, to just being like, okay, well, that awareness is the ground of existence and all of the universe is a dream. I'm not saying that. But what I do think is that when you have that experience, or you shed that identification with the narrative, and you feel that unitive unfolding of existence, what you discover is you're not really a separate self. That was always an idea that you were kind of overlaying on experience. You also discover that you're not truly separate. So you're not a self, you're not separate, and that actually reality isn't made of some solid substance. There isn't actually a really solid ground of matter. Solidity is something that arises in experience as an experience. So this leads me in the book to say, I think part of the reason we're confused about consciousness and matter is that we don't realize these things are mental constructs, self-separation and substance. We think we're a genuinely separate brain inhabiting the body, and that brain is a solid material thing made of a substance that needs to somehow map onto this immaterial consciousness. And so when you see through that, I'm saying that reality is, I'm not saying it's all mind, but what I say is it's a relational process. It's an interdependent process. So this has a kind of, very respectable lineage in philosophy. We're talking about reality being like a flowing river, but it's kind of made of events or occurrences. It's not made of little building blocks. And it's interdependent, it's like everything's woven together. It's a single fabric. I think when you take that seriously, you say that someone who says that they've awakened from the dream of being a separate self, instead of saying, oh, you're having some delusional experience, if you take that seriously, that actually they've seen something that's more true, that it truly is a mistaken perception to think you're genuinely separate. If you take that seriously, then I think everything falls into place. And the way that I think it falls into place, to get to the second message of the book, is that experience emerges, I think, with life. And I think it's not that the brain is like some computer that runs a really, fancy computer program that creates consciousness, which is this kind of computational view is very common. But instead, consciousness or experience is it's a knowingness that has to arise in order to exist as something that's like orderly over time. So life, unlike, if you pour milk into coffee, it's going to dissolve very quickly, right? And it's all going to mix together. Life doesn't do that. If you did that if the drop of milk was like life, it would start to dissolve and it would gather itself up and it would pulsate and it would, you look at that and you go, oh, something weird's happening there. Something very interesting's happening. And that's the kind of interesting physics that life has. And when you look at that physics, what you discover is, to do that, it has to be interfacing with the world. It has to be simulating the world around it. It has to be engaged in some kind of knowingness. It has to reach out beyond what's physically adjacent to it and has to know or try to know. It has to kind of simulate or believe what's going on in the world around it. So that's the fundamental message of the book, is that like the knowingness of consciousness is what it feels like to be this like embodied evolutionary process. And I don't mean evolution like through species over time. I mean like in your lifetime, moment to moment, your organism is discovering how to not die, basically, but just how to keep going and to fit into its niche in existence. And I think that's what experience is. And that evolutionary process, actually, again, speaking in terms of like fractals and scale-free stuff, like that applies at all levels. In terms of like, I don't think like anything that differentiates itself from its environment does this same kind of process. But I don't want to say, I don't think it's experience in the case of like the way an atom keeps itself together, or the way that the process of evolution of species over time keeps, that follows the same mathematical logic. I don't think that's associated with experience. You could argue it. You could say that it could become a kind of panpsychist view where actually at all scales there's some kind of diffuse consciousness. I don't think at that point I really know what that would be. Like, because for me, to be conscious is to have a perspective. And so I'm like holding myself together as an organism and I'm looking out through these eyes from this perspective. And so I think that's why I don't think that the process of evolution, even though it's following, you can totally describe it as a process of knowledge gathering, in terms of like the giraffe is like embodied knowledge of how tall the trees are in its environment. This is all been unpacked kind of scientifically. Anyway, so that's the kind of summary of the point I'm making. And it's like, because of the interdependence of existence, I'm not saying that, life forms are these genuinely separate little alienated things. It's rather that we're like the eyes with which the universe sees. The universe wakes up through us because it's like the interdependent structure of existence comes together to form us, not intentionally, it just kind of happens. And then we can take in existence. So that I'm offering this as a corrective to the mainstream view, which is that, or the mainstream assumption that it needs to be something to do with brains or nervous systems. It has to be something to do with being having a genuinely separate brain that's kind of fancy enough, complicated enough. It's the kind of the gut instinct level in the way people talk about it seems to be, it's got to be something to do with how cool and special we are as a species. And like again and again, I think that's tripped us up in our thinking about this stuff. And actually, if we remember that we're fully part of nature, that we are kin with all other living things, I think that's the corrective. And I think we took a wrong turn a few hundred years ago with Descartes and the kind of origins of colonization and capitalism, and at the same time, suppression of psychedelics. In the Americas, I think this is very much the human exceptionalism, supremacist way of being. That way of being is what created the gap between mind and matter in its modern manifestation. And we need to not do that. Basically, like animists, people who see experience as being widespread throughout the natural world and see us as kin with other living things, I think they're fundamentally on the right track.
Amazing. There's so much to unpack.
I tried to give you the whole point of the book.
Yeah, this is great. This is a great summary, and I'm really looking forward to really dive in and probably like study some parts of it, especially there's a few points that I want to dive in, if you don't mind. Before we go there, can we talk about the illusion of humanity's assumed dominance over nature.
Right.
So you said about the humans feeling special, so we're special species. Does that play into that as well? And what else do we think we're special and we have dominance over? Like what kind of things?
Yeah. So there's like, I guess it's like, there's this idea, this phrase "might makes right," where if someone's like a bully and they're like strong enough to dominate everyone else, then there's this like narrative that they deserve that position, which is it's usually that phrase is brought up to as a kind of say it's a fallacy. You're only in power because you're powerful, not because you deserve to be. So I guess by analogy, there's like a sense that like might signals some like betterness in some other sense rather than just power. I think that pervades our species, well, not our species even. We see this kind of supremacist domination like way of thinking playing out where, with like colonization, like, there's a thing of because of certain historical circumstances that led to kind of Westerners, like Western Europeans dominating different countries, then there became the supremacist logic of like, we did it because we're better rather than like, it's just kind of an accident of history. So it's a similar thing, I think, where humans are dominant in terms of our capacity to extract from nature. And so there's that practical sense. And then from that, it's driven by a clearly like a kind of, a certain kind of, in its modern form, there's a lack of that recognition that we are consuming the ground from underneath us, like in terms of the fact that we depend on the webs of nature for our existence. We are, manifestation of those webs of nature. And yet our economies are like destroying it at a very fast rate without seeing, it's like a kind of auto cannibalism. It's like if you were starving and you were like eating your own stomach to try to survive. It's like it's like a truly insane mode to be in. And I think in that mode, you're in such a kind of psychosis that you need to tell yourself a story. You're doing something so deranged and depraved. You need to tell yourself a story that you're actually really amazing. I think this is like, you see this in like narcissistic psychology in terms of people kind of abusing people, then victim blaming, and just really getting into this loop where the worse they behave, they can't possibly look at themselves in the mirror. So they need to tell themselves the higher the stakes get, the more it needs to be true that I'm perfect and great and everyone else is wrong. And so I think it's the same kind of like egoic, narcissistic dynamics that fuel our like the thing of like, well, humans are the best and we deserve to plunder the earth. And I mean, that's just how I see it.
It seems like it's in the web. It's everywhere. It's the same sort of replicated behavior in everywhere, right? Why do you think we end up? I mean, why don't we born conscious? Like, what do you think is going on there? Do you think the whole lifespan is the experience to come and wake up to ourselves? Therefore, the universe wakes up to itself.
Yeah. So I think we are. Well, yeah. So I guess if you're talking about becoming conscious in a kind of spiritual sense of some heightened awareness of, or just when I talk about consciousness initially, I'm just talking about feeling, having an experience. So if I think a worm has any experience, if it feels bad to it if someone puts salt on it and it shrivels up and as it's dying, if that feels bad to it, then it's conscious, it's having an experience. And I actually do think that babies, when they're born, a lot of the received wisdom has been that they don't have experience, which I think is ridiculous. They're just like little robots that are screaming and they don't actually feel pain. I think that's ridiculous, and that it's more the fact that for the first years of their life, the way that their memories are being laid down aren't retrievable in later life, probably due to before they've acquired language. So I think, there's a lot more consciousness, a lot more experience in life than we think. And then I actually think that, I guess my views align a lot with, I guess, a kind of, like Taoism and Buddhism and these perspectives where actually a lot of the time there isn't a kind of a narrative of purpose or meaning or driving at anything. Like in the Western traditions, there's a lot of like, we're really heading towards the climax of like, revelation and we're really going somewhere. Whereas I think that really when you drop below the level of the mind, I think all that's basically happening on the level of the mind, that fantasy of being a person who likes things and doesn't like other things and wants to go somewhere. I think actually there is only ever this unfolding moment, and it's just happening exactly as it's happening. And it's meaningless in the most wonderful way, in that it's just, you can just let go of needing to struggle with it and needing to find meaning in it. And it's just play. It's just complete liberation and play. So I think people wake up because, in my case, it was kind of suffering and desperation and just a kind of glitch in the system. Just happened to be certain circumstances aligned. It's a complete opposite of me having any particularly like good traits that led to it. It was in fact the kind of complete opposite, that like I was so invested, so tightly wound up in that mind identified state. I was so suffering so intensely, and it just so happened the thing I was suffering over was a dead end, and I couldn't, a bit like a riddle, I couldn't solve it. It was to do with theological stuff around God and wanting to have blind faith, but I couldn't have blind faith, and so I just went in a loop until the system crashed, and then I just looked around and I was just 100% free from all that suffering in an instant. And it was really obvious from that point that I'd been doing this weird fixated thing. I mean, call it weird, it's the thing that we all do. We're all born with the cognitive machine to do this thing of mistaking our ideas for reality. But I hadn't realized I was playing with ideas in awareness in the present moment. I was seeing through those ideas and taking them to be absolutely solid and real. So when I was worried about the possibility of hell, it wasn't that I was entertaining a thought about hell. It was that I was thinking about hell, like hell really as a possibility of existing and me suffering in it. And it's a very tricky illusion because, those thoughts can point to things like I can think about drinking coffee later. And in some sense, I'm having a thought about coffee now, but it also does point to something that can happen in real life. But it's getting clear on that, noticing once you notice that thoughts are arising now and you see that really clearly, that's when like past and future kind of drop away, and you realize you have the freedom of just being in the present moment as everything's expressing. And I realize I've just gone off on a tangent. I can't even remember what the question was we were talking about there.
No problem. So the question was like, why can't we be from birth be conscious of this, that we're not separate?
Yeah. So I just think it's kind of evolutionary programming. So yeah, my point of that tangent was to say that it was just circumstances that led to a crashing of the system, and then what was revealed isn't anything that you can own or you can earn, because it's just beingness. It's just what's already here before you're overlaying your ideas on it. So everyone has access to it. It's fully available for everyone in every moment. You don't need to meditate your entire life. You don't actually need to do psychedelics, but like the habituated fixation of the thinking the ideas are real is so strong that I think for a lot of people it's easier said than done to say, well, just stop doing that, because of that. So I think it's like our physiological machinery is just programmed to do that, presumably because it had some survival advantage. And so I think the self and that whole mindset is a bit of a kind of sick joke, really, by evolution. That's just, it's not doing it on purpose, but it's like when you're in that paradigm, it's like it's all self-referential, and it's like, well, because I think I care about X, Y, Z, then I can't do this and that, and it's just this like, if you just step outside it, you look at that paradigm, you're like, wow, like that's a whole knot of like, it's like struggle, and it's the fact that it's possible to step outside is the most wonderful thing in the world. But it's like, yeah. So when from that perspective outside, it's like, it just feels like an unfortunate thing that arose in evolution, in the same way that like our current situation, cultural evolution happened. It just so happened that certain economic systems for now can create immense suffering, and that's just on the table. I think because of the kind of unbounded nature of existence, that there are no hard stops in existence. It's not like it's like, okay, the universe is expanding, but actually on the left, there's like, nope, you're not going to go any further here. Or with evolution, it's like it can just keep going and creating new niches, and new things can keep happening. So, a creature could exist where, say there was like a bee that managed to do something to the brains of everything in the hive, where they all like tortured themselves, but somehow that gave it energy. Like hells like that can basically just emerge because there aren't any, there isn't anything to stop it. But I think the good news is that level of discord, the kind of discord we're experiencing now, I think is transient. When you look at nature, you tend to see harmony more than systems torturing themselves. You don't, the thing I just described isn't very common. I can't really think of any other examples other than us at this point in history. and yeah, when you look at to kind of indigenous, groups, it seems like they're in a lot more harmonious state, and that's the real irony of the narratives of colonizers saying that indigenous people were primitive and they were more advanced. Because I think, especially when you look at like in North America, you had like the Mississippi Mound civilization. So there were like civilizations, and then the anthropologist David Graeber wrote about the idea that like it's very plausible that actually the indigenous peoples of the Americas experimented with that, and they were like, actually, you know what, this kind of hierarchical way of being like leads to toxic dynamics. Like we're not doing this. We're going to be very intentional in the way that we live close to nature and stuff. So it's actually a more highly evolved, like a more highly evolved way of being than the current mode. And so I think over time, the good news is that I think these evolution dynamics do lead to harmony, do lead to a kind of evening out. But yeah, I basically, again, this is my being a scientist showing, but also my spirituality aligns very much with this in terms of just everything's just happening and there are no guarantees. And that's partly why we suffer, because it's like that boundlessness of existence is like we're falling forward all the time, and we're like, and so we want to put on the brakes and struggle with existence and try to navigate, and that kind of, I guess it's almost like that works to some extent. And so that propagates through like evolution, like whatever works, spreads. And so suddenly everyone's like doing this thing where we're struggling with existence. And then the joke is that if you stop doing that, you discover that you're falling forward, but there's no grounds that it's like jumping out of a plane without a parachute and then discovering there's no floor to hit. It's like terrifying at first. And then you're like, oh, it's okay to just let go and be in the flow. So that's why I say it's a bit like a sick joke, because it's like, it only feels like a problem when you're doing it. It's like a very self-referential thing.
Yeah. Once you break out of it, no longer grips, no longer is there the suffering. Do you think environment informs the suffering? Do you think somehow environment is kind of limiting people in order to become fully potentially aware?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, something I've seen more and more is that I think that I used to, so we were talking before about orienting to kind of wholeness and healing separation. And I used to focus on that in terms of like, this is why psychedelics are powerful, because they can really help the individual to make that move, because we are the fabric of society. And so we need to be the ones to kind of work on ourselves as well as creating material change to improve our situation. But then I kind of came to see that there's a hard block on that ability to change if you're not well supported. In my own life, like it was when I felt like I was in touch with people who were genuinely emotionally wise and supportive, that's when the truly transformative change happened. And I've seen this with other people, which was really interesting to see that. Yeah, like I guess again, it's an illusion to think that we are separate individuals. We are manifestations of our community, of our like context, of our environment. So absolutely, there is no separation between environment and the individual, which I think is really important to know when it comes to psychedelics in particular, and why I'd like to see a lot more kind of, I like things like decriminalization movements, and like I'd love to see more of those models of bottom-up community-based healing instead of the medical. I mean, maybe not instead of, because it's great to, something like MDMA for PTSD, like that's great that people can get that through a medical model. But yeah, like for that transformative change, I think that, holding space is a bit of a kind of, a lot of people don't like that as a kind of hippie kind of term, but I think the idea of, like supporting each other, being a safe, I mean, that's basically what we're missing is a critical mass of wisdom and true compassion, true egoless, like love for each other, that we're like, and you see this with like spirituality, where the norm, or at least very common, is toxic gurus who are like, abusive, and it's actually someone manipulating this good stuff for their own personal agenda. And so that's the opposite of what I'm talking about, so the finding truly like true spiritual nourishment in the form of like truly compassionate ways people is very rare. And we need to, if we're going to produce the change that we want, I think somehow we need to catalyze that. We need more people like that, more communities like that, more and then then the psychedelics and that stuff becomes a kind of, again, like a catalyst for this process, but the process has to be contained within something much wiser than what we currently have.
Totally agree. It's almost like this whole consciousness evolution or our self-awareness or growth comes from being with other nervous systems, and yet paradoxically being with other nervous systems in some communities can be very toxic at the same time. So there is this catch there, there is and I meet so many people, and people are becoming very wary of these communities and kind of being put off. They don't really want to be in group settings. Every time you want to bring people into a group to process something or grow together or share a space, it's almost like, no, I'm not interested in groups, because they had already references from past that it was a bad idea.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me on my own journey on an ayahuasca retreat, a group share was one of the most transformative things I experienced, because I did a lot of my journey, again, having internalized this individualistic way of being, did a lot of it by myself. And then that moment of kind of being vulnerable in front of other people was incredibly powerful. So luckily, in that moment, I kind of internalized a sense of positive framing for those things. But I'm sure, it happens a lot, I think, where people think that certain groups, certain, people are like the toxic ones, and that actually we can find that actually if you just turn away from those people and find your group, you won't see those dynamics. But actually then I've seen again and again people saying how surprised they are to find these kinds of dynamics, kind of, I guess, like egoic, unsafe feeling dynamics everywhere. And I think this is what, again, why it comes down to spirituality, because it really is just the ego, that it's like it has this programming has this agenda of like me first, but in an unconscious way, where I'll distort how I perceive things in a way that allows me to not go into my own pain. I won't even know that I'm doing it. And so if someone says something I don't like because it triggers that part of me, I'll genuinely perceive that they're being mean to me, and then I'll lash out. And like, so you always think you're in the right. It kind of goes back to what I was saying before about that thing of like, the more you're misbehaving, the more you convince yourself you're in the right. And so like, this is just the normal egoic mindset. And it's, that's why it's hard. And it's like I said before, when you're in the game of the mind, it's like I guess it's like a downward spiral of lowest common denominator, where it's like a fear-based thing, where once one person starts behaving like that, other people don't feel safe to open up, and then everyone contracts and they don't want to do the group stuff. So yeah, I'm in no way an expert in how to navigate that terrain, but I think it's hugely important that people experiment with like models of like, how can we come into wise, non-egoic community and hold that space for each other. If there's one thing we need more than anything now, it's that kind of community building, I think.
Yeah, I agree fully. What really I'm thinking right now is the distinguishing consciousness from self-awareness, because a lot of in the self-growth or transformational spaces, consciousness is thrown around like it's very difficult to understand. Do you have any idea how should we put that in context?
Yeah, so that's a great distinction. So as I'm using it, as I mentioned before, I'm just talking about experience, any kind of feeling. It's basically synonym for experience. So if there's any experience at all, that thing is conscious. And people use these terms differently. For me, I use the term awareness for, I mentioned before, this kind of pristine space in which all the experiences, the contents of consciousness arise. And self-awareness, so I mentioned at the start the idea that we are a self, that we are, you can say there is a body here, but the body is a process. It's like it's not a truly separate thing. But when I say the self, I don't mean the body. I mean that feeling of being in the head, looking out from the eyes. And I think a lot of thinking about consciousness just takes for granted that we are some kind of self, and that self becomes conscious. And so we're like, people will look at the kind of, most evolutionary recent parts of the brain and think that it's something to do with being a subject who can interrogate different parts of the brain, and that there's some mechanism there that embodies being a subject. And I'm saying that whole dualistic relationship of subject-object is actually a kind of a structure that arises, an interface that arises within experience. So you have, the organism is associated with this, this body here is associated with this field of awareness, but then within it, this, the hands that I'm looking at now and the body, this is like an avatar that's arising within the conscious experience, a bit like in a video game if you're looking over the shoulder of the character, but then you think you genuinely are the character. So this is like a character in the awareness, and the impression of being in the head of the character is a pure illusion. That's not what's happening. There's this wide open awareness in which everything's arising. And so when you see that, then it suddenly, after psychedelics, there have been studies that show that people do generalize consciousness more widely. They're a lot more comfortable with the idea of plant consciousness or panpsychism, idealism, that everything's conscious. And I think that's because they go from thinking, well, it's something to do with me being this like complex human who can think and can interrogate my own experience. Like that's what it is to be conscious, some kind of self-awareness, standing out under the stars and philosophizing about our place in existence. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the divide between consciousness and the physical world in our understanding of existence. We're just talking about the taste of coffee, the blue of the sky, like these experiences. And when you realize that they are experiences arising in this pristine awareness that feels very simple and very grounded in the unfolding of existence, then you can be like, oh, like a butterfly could have this, a worm could have this. This is just, the lights are on. Like it's a very, it's not that complicated subject-object thing. It's just that the lights are on. And that's when I think to make sense of why the lights are on, you need to look to that thing of that knowingness, as I mentioned before, of being an embodied evolutionary process, trying to navigate in the world, that you need to reach out, you need to try to know. And I think that's what that awareness is that space of knowingness in which our different beliefs about what could be going on, simulating what's going on in the world arises in.
Yes, it's truly powerful once you it's like going into a rabbit hole to really dig into it. So in your book, there is a groundbreaking perspective that you share, which is consciousness as to be the feature of all life, right? For life forms, and then the argument is that therefore AI will never be conscious, which is a very hot topic at the moment, right? AI and ChatGPT and all these, Yeah, what are your thoughts, and where did you come to this conclusion?
Yeah, so the picture I just described, in which consciousness is what it feels like to be this embodied process of life that is a kind of it's like a condensed evolutionary process playing out in our lifetime as we're trying to know what's going on in the world, trying to simulate what's going on in the world around us so that we can survive. So, and I mentioned earlier that this physics of knowingness evolves in a kind of scale-free or fractal way, where you could talk about atoms as showing similar dynamics, even though, as I mentioned, I don't think we should think of them as being conscious, but you could say proto-consciousness, but without actual experiential content. But so there's like this emergence of, it's to do with the emergence of forms that are genuinely manifestations of the unfolding of existence. I think and this is the kind of thing people can experience with kind of mystical states, psychedelic-induced mystical experiences, the feeling of being truly part of the unfolding of existence. Now, you can this kind of physics of knowingness I'm talking about, there's actually, those principles do exist in AI systems. There are these things called variational autoencoders, which basically follow the same kind of logic, and I think they can be very powerful for AI and especially for kind of autonomous systems. And they can do this kind of unsupervised learning. That's kind of the parallel here, is that if you can train an AI and give it a bunch of giraffes and tell it, okay, here's a bunch of giraffes and here's a bunch of dogs, tell the difference between these. But that's not how we learn. We are in every moment trying to bootstrap ourselves into existence, where no one's telling us. When you're a kid, you don't get shown 100 giraffes and told that's a giraffe, that's a giraffe. You don't get that kind of feedback. So the way we work is this kind of, you basically make any guess, and then you fine tune it based on the feedback you're getting. And turns out that's an incredibly powerful way to hone in on the structures of existence. And so this is called unsupervised learning and like machine learning and AI, where you can basically be like, here's a bunch of data. I'm actually not going to tell you what's in it or even what the problem is. And this AI will suck out what are called kind of latent spaces, where it's like, it seems like there are these really long-necked things over here, and it seems like there are these short-necked things over here. And then after it's done that, you'll be like, oh yeah, those are giraffes, those are dogs. So it actually doesn't need the labeling. It can do that for itself. So why aren't they conscious if they show the same principles? The fundamental difference is I describe this kind of that we are a truly kind of emergent part of existence that shows these dynamics, in this embodied way that's to do with our survival. And then these models are models of that. We're mapping and coming up with mathematical kind of formulas to describe those dynamics. But in the same way, if I write these down on a napkin and I show you that napkin, you wouldn't say, oh, well, now that napkin's conscious. You'd be like, no, like obviously, like your dog and the way it's living its life. If I write down all the equations, it's an abstraction. It's a model that you could say it's like the writing on the napkin just isn't the same thing. And then you could be like, okay, well, what if I do all the sums and then I give you the output and I tell you what you would do next moment? Yeah. And then you go, okay, well, now I'm going to do the sums on the computer. And now it's like AI. It's still just like a very complex napkin. You've programmed it. We as this outside intelligence have programmed it. Even if you put it into like a Roomba or like something where it has autonomous states and it can start doing its own thing, it's still a very fancy model. It's a bit like it will never be the true unfolding knowingness of what it is to be a real thing. So I think that's again why we kind of come back to mystical experiences, because when I'm talking about this deep groundedness as the unfolding of existence, when we feel like we are the idea of the self, people may not, I mean, with this audience, they probably have some sense of this, but to the average kind of scientist, they might go like, what the heck are you talking about being the ground, the unfolding of existence? And so if you're in that state, you may not get what the difference is here. But if you know what that is like to feel that, then you might have a sense of, oh yeah, like the napkin's never going to feel that. The transistors on a computer are never going to feel that. Like they're simulation, they're like abstractions, models. They're not the thing in itself trying to bubbling up and unfolding in this way. It's a bit like if you ran a really good simulation of a tornado or like a hurricane on your computer and expected your computer to get wet as a result, it's just not going to happen. It's a simulation. It's not the thing itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is so valuable. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
So we can all relax. Yeah,
we can all relax. But yeah, I should say that if we say we create an AI system and it actually basically becomes like artificial life, say it's made of silicon and it starts to evolve and it's truly autonomous and it becomes kind of artificial life, I think that would be conscious, because that would be showing the same dynamics. But crucially, the way you would create that wouldn't be to design it and set it going. What you could do is design the conditions to coax it into existence, in the same way that if you want to create a bathtub if you want to create a whirlpool in a bathtub by pulling out you can fill up the water and you can pull out the drain and it will create this structure. We're that kind of emergent structure. So sure, you could put the silicon beads together and you could come up with like the right conditions, but fundamentally you can't create a whirlpool by putting all the atoms in the right place and then pushing them. That's just not how it works. It's because of the coherence of existence as a whole that all the interdependencies come together to create whatever the structure is. So it would be like that. At that point, would it really be AI? I think it would just be life. It would just be life that we have spawned through coaxing into existence in a different form.
Yeah. Wow. Totally. I was just saying earlier, we can all relax and stop fearing AI.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah. What are your thoughts in the latest trending? Everyone's using ChatGPT in their pockets. Yeah. What do you think of that trend?
Yeah, it's definitely very powerful, right? But it leads us, I think, it typically serves, that problem-solving rational mind, the egoic mind. It's like great for problem-solving, right? So that's I think, was it Deepak Chopra? Someone had a book about how to use chatbots to like help your spiritual practice, which, maybe you can do that. Maybe you can like use it to, but I get the impression it's probably going to just accelerate the way our culture is just so obsessed with control and limitless extraction and control of the world. And interestingly, these kinds of dynamics I'm talking about in living systems, I mentioned it's like a living system keeps itself together in the way that like a drop of milk and coffee would have to kind of basically look like it was breathing. It would have to kind of gather itself up over time, to not disperse. That way of being is to be orderly, and that to be orderly is to have some control over your environment. If you don't have some control, some ability to navigate, you're screwed. You're going to dissolve. Like, a rock doesn't try and navigate in this environment, and it can just break apart in any moment, right? So it's because of this like evolutionary imperative to survive that I think actually we do get experience, but we also get runaway intelligence that is inherently destructive when it's not checked by some wise imperative to homeostasis, to rebalancing, to kind of giving back as well as taking. Because it's, for me to remain orderly, it's very much about pushing the disorder outside me and keeping the order inside me. That's the fundamental game at the kind of physics level. So I think you can see it's precisely because humans have become so dominant on the planet that we're so destructive. I think it's hard for me to imagine a kind of solar punk future where we keep growing but there's some kind of ecological harmony. It seems to be kind of built into the system that the more we want to dominate, the more we destroy. So I mean, I opened up a whole can of worms there talking about different kind of visions of how you could do this. But I think in like, when we're looking at our economic system, it sounds kind of simple, but it's the last thing we want to hear, which is that like, I don't think there are going to be like green solutions within our current economic system. We just need degrowth. We just need to move in the opposite direction. Like the system is one of craving and destruction, and it just needs to do the opposite of that. We just need to put the system in reverse. And like, but we don't want to do that because that we like all, it's like our environment, you kind of point to this earlier, our environments are constructed to disempower us, to keep us from being actualized, and to keep us kind of invest in the system. So we're a kind of most wounded versions of ourselves that just want to soothe and consume, and we don't have the energy to kind of make a better world. And because of that, it's this like circular thing, like I was talking about before, with like, you need the wise, compassionate people to build the community, to help people heal. But each of those steps kind of needs the other one. It's like an ecosystem. So it's hard to see like, how do you start that process going? If you have the psychedelics, but you don't have the wise people, and so it's a similar thing where like we don't have the kind of collective awakening to realize what direction we need to go in. And we also, even if we did, people's first reaction would be like, oh, I can't, like, I just need to get through the day and make the ends meet. And understandably, like the system's structured to be like that you can't make rent and you can't, you've got your concerns. So the solution is kind of simple, but and this is the same thing with individual suffering. The solution is simple, which is to stop the game of your own egoic like pursuits, basically. I mean, not on like a practical level, you can do that, but on an emotional way that your mind is structured, you kind of need to surrender. And just like the spiritual pathway is about letting go of attachments, letting go of surrender. It's, if you want to be like, well, no, I'm going to keep these attachments and do like struggle with it, like you're back in the game of struggle. But it's kind of the last thing that the ego wants to hear is like, your way of doing things isn't working. I mean, that's again why like suffering is often the most authentic way for people to come to spirituality. It's just like, I'm genuinely fed up of this game. I'm suffering a lot. I need a different way of being. And so unfortunately, I think from seeing the way that individuals kind of go through transformative experiences and stuff like that, most of the time people need to hit absolute rock bottom, I think, before they try something else. And interestingly, that also comes out of these dynamics I was talking about before. There's a certain kind of like, you keep doing whatever's worked for you in the past, seems to be a kind of an evolutionary like survival dynamic. So people will just really keep, even if it's causing them pain, they'll stay in their rut, like bet the devil that rather than turn towards the unknown and say try psychedelics or whatever their friends are telling them they need to do to heal. And my fear is that that's where we're heading kind of as a culture is to some brick wall of ecological breakdown, climate catastrophe, and fascistic politics and war and water shortages and all that stuff. But that I guess that there could be the other side of that could be some kind of catharsis of like sobering up and healing. But the messed up thing about that is that the people at the front of the train that's going to hit the brick wall are all the people in the global south, and I'm relatively towards the back of the train in my privilege. So I'm not saying that with any casual like, oh well, like let's just let that happen. It's just my I guess part of my own way of reckoning with the stuff is to realize that I think a big part of my approach needs to be grieving, needs to be not deluding myself that we're on a runaway freight train that's hard to put on the brakes. Once again, you didn't ask anything about that, but sorry, I just ended up quite a bleak prognosis.
it's the most natural thing to end up here. I feel like, I feel like all these methods and, concepts and everything that we're creating in the space to support life and move forward, grow, always ends up in looking at the ground zero of what's actually going on, right? And at the moment, I don't know, so many people talk about the consciousness shift is happening, everyone's going to wake up. I don't know, I'm sometimes thinking, really, I don't know, maybe humanity's always been like that. Imagine like Rumi. I'm sure Rumi and his friends 100 years ago, or however long time ago, probably they sat in a dark room and said, consciousness is shifting, we got to wake up.
Right.
I'm sure they did that. I'm sure periodically in history this is very very much the journey of the humanity, I think.
Yeah.
And I find that at the time, the age, and the current stage, I think we're all feeling that pressure. And I think a lot of people are, like you said, doing so many things, running in circles, hit the rock bottom, and then realize, I'm ready to let go now.
Yeah.
It seems like that.
Yeah. And it's truly terrifying to imagine what that looks like for a global civilization. But
yeah,
I mean, when you really touch into the present moment, you contact a kind of sense of the eternal, and a remembering that even if we absolutely nail this, somehow we like completely avert climate change and we create a global utopia, which I would love. Fast forward to 500 years, like 1,000 years, like we're going to fall into some other catastrophe. Like the roller coaster keeps going. There is, we yearn for some resolution to get off the ride of existence, but actually, I mentioned before this like perpetual falling forward, the boundlessness of the journey of existence. It's going to keep going, and there isn't going to be a fixed endpoint, and that can make the mind freak out a bit because it wants fixed categories. But I guess the advice is to surrender into that in this moment, because it's always happening now. Is this the eternal, not as timeless future, but like as always now, always unfolding. And you can orient to that, and you can open to that. It's about experientially opening and facing your demons and letting them move through and coming into the right relationship with the world. And I think even though the picture I painted is kind of pessimistic from the level of the mind that wants solutions and is worried about, understandably worried about horrific things happening, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything about it. And I think to honor yourself and to be in right relationship is to do everything you can that you feel authentically motivated to do, to be as awake as possible to our situation and to show up in that way. And ironically, if you do that from a place of groundedness and acceptance and letting the emotions move through you, letting yourself grieve, if we all did that, I think that would be the thing that would transform the world. It's like what you resist persists. It's like, because we're like in this egoic struggling mindset that we're adding to the fire of separation. And if en masse we stopped doing that, or oriented away from that more, not stopped entirely because it can be practical, but that would be the thing I think that would quench the fire, or at least all the stuff we spoke about with community, right? Like even or maybe especially in the worst case scenario socially, we need to seed wise communities who can support people through a time of immensely painful transition, and then hopefully it could be a birth as well as a dying, and a composting of an old, fragile, toxic culture into something more beautiful.
I love that. Thank you so much. And this is where your book comes in. And I think one of the biggest messages here is understanding our interconnected existence. I think we need to come together as soon as possible. The separation has to end as soon as possible. I feel like the more we are separated, there is a phenomenon that I heard. I can't remember who said this. I think it was Dr. Stan Grof. He says that there is a part of us, although we have a survival looping, running around the circle and repeating the same thing, even if it's bad for us, that we cannot distinguish to just kind of snap out of it. However, he said, there is also another part of us that continually seeks to bring everything to whole. And sometimes that part that seeks to bring everything together can implode, can create catastrophe, so that we can finally get there.
Right.
Feels like this is what's happening also in environment in the world globally currently, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. And also, I mean, I think I catch myself when I say like what we need to do or we must do or whatever, because ironically, like the lack of acceptance of exactly where we're at is the seed of that that struggling with existence, that separation, that rejecting what's here and now. And so there's the deepest surrender you can do is to fall in love with everything exactly as it is, because it just is exactly as it is. And I guess that's where, like, despite being raised Christian and really rejecting it as a teenager, I came again and again to see the wisdom in Christianity as a spiritual tradition in terms of the figure of Jesus and the crucifixion, in that, like, in that moment, there's true mortification of the ego in the service of love. If you can grieve everything and just be like, and put out your own egoic fire to that extent, where you're willing to feel all the pain about it and let it be as it is, and show up to reduce suffering, but not because you need to not feel your feelings, because that's a lot of what goes on in terms of, like, I don't want to feel this, so I need things to change now because it's about me. If you get rid of that personal bit and you let all the emotions move through, then you can show up and be like, reality is perfect in its manifestation as it is, and through my human mind, I can see all the suffering that I want to help improve, and both those things can coexist and support each other. But it requires you to have the courage to really face yourself in your deepest parts that you don't want to go into. But if you do go there, there's a harmony that you wouldn't expect, I guess.
Yeah. And this is a beautiful way to close our conversation as we come to the end. I'm sure probably we can go on much longer.
Yeah.
We might have to come back again
Yeah, I'd love that.
soon. Yeah, let's come back again and follow up on your book and how it's doing. And also, before we let you go, can you tell us where our listeners can find you and where can they purchase your book?
That'd be great. Yeah, thank you. You can get it all good bookstores, all the usual places. And I'd point people to innerspaceinstitute.org is my new kind of thing I've started, which is, for the last how many years I've been talking in public, I've been talking at this level, like, about ideas and stuff, and pointing to the spiritual stuff and the path, but not. I've been working in the background on, like, guided meditations and advice, and how people can kind of do this kind of stuff, because I wasn't personally happy with all the materials that were out there, and so I've now put that together, as you can find it in spaceinstitute.org, and that's for anyone who feels they want to do this orienting to wholeness, exploring their own experience, facing themselves. Contributing to that healing that we all need, then that's a place to go. There's some free materials. You can also sign up to be a member, which helps support and the project, and then allows me to put more time into creating new materials. And then you can find me at Dr. James Cooke with an E on the end, on kind of Instagram and Twitter and YouTube as well. I've got a YouTube channel with a podcast called Living Mirrors. drjamescooke.com. Yeah, I think that's all the things. And the book is The Dawn of Mind, How Matter Became Conscious and Alive, and it's out on the 3rd of December in North America.
Amazing. This is beautiful. And you are hosting Living Mirrors podcast.
Right. Yeah, I've been doing that for a few years now. Yeah.
Which is a great resource to allow people to get to know you and your journey.
I touch on all these different things we've been talking about. The compliments I've gotten about it often tend to revolve around the diversity of topics, but they all cohere in the way that has come out in this conversation. So there's conversations with leading really big figures in consciousness science, but also psychedelic science, and even like ecology and animism, like anything I think is relevant to this. Because I think the picture we've tried to convey, I think, is quite simple in its core in terms of wholeness versus separation and discord versus harmony and all that kind of stuff. But it turns out, because it's this like fractal thing, it's like it takes a lot to talk about the different aspects of the whole. But yeah, people can go there. There's a large back catalogue of conversations there.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And we'll add the link to our first conversation. I think you touched more about your personal story there as well. They can kind of get to know you also that way. We'll have your bio, the links and the book link, everything in the show notes. And we will see you very soon, James. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Please do comment, ask questions, and share your experiences in the comments. Don't be shy. I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.